This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
So first, I want to say thank you for having me here, and to the organizers. And it's been great to be in Pensacola for the past 24 hours, and I'm hopeful that what I'll share with you will have actual practical applicability and not just be pure science. So, as Dr. Ford mentioned, I'm at the University of Florida's Institute on Aging, where I've been for the past 15 years. And so this is a passion of mine to try to understand how we can basically help live our best lives for as long as possible. So that's the underlying topic of this talk. Okay. But more scientifically, to give an outline, first I want to kind of talk about some of the changes that occur with aging and what drives these changes, and then what we can learn from better understanding the biology of aging. And then the theme of this talk is going to be related to the importance of stress and recovery. Many people want to avoid stress, but I'm here to tell you that some stress is actually needed if we want to stay healthy. And talk about the role that lifestyle factors have in producing positive adaptations, and then ultimately with some conclusions. So we'll first start off with this question of what is aging in general, and what do we mean when we say aging? And a lot of people, when they think about aging, is hard to directly define, but the concept is a decrease in physiological function that leads to a decrease in fitness level, which ultimately results in loss of independence. And so what we focus on, much of our research, is on how do we extend what's called the person's health span, or the length of time that a person is living healthy and independent and functional and engaged in society, not just alive. Okay. And so this chart depicts what the top line, let me see, here we go, depicts what the kind of the goal is, where there's little loss of function over the course of one's life, and that an individual maintains their strength, their functional ability, cognitive ability throughout their entire life until the very end. But the reality is that that is not the case for many people, and unfortunately, this lower line better depicts the trajectory that occurs to a number of individuals, particularly in the United States, and results in, unfortunately, disability and the need for extended care. So a big focus here is, well, how do we get ourselves closer to the upper line, and what can we do? Well, to better answer that question, we need to first explore what are the factors that are driving this loss of mobility, particularly with aging. And from my standpoint, there's obviously a variety of factors, but some of the main factors I think are depicted in this diagram, or this figure. With aging, maybe you've experienced this. When you exercise, I certainly have, you experience a little bit more discomfort as you exercise compared to when you were younger. As a result, you may also feel more sore, greater levels of stiffness, and conclude that this isn't good to do. And and as a result, stop doing that, and thing that causes soreness and discomfort. But the problem, unfortunately, with that is that that can lead to lower levels of activity, which means that you're expending less energy, which means that you're more likely to gain weight if your caloric intake remains the same as it was prior to the time when you were exercising. And as this figure shows, that can lead to this cycle where, with the weight gain, even more discomfort occurs, more soreness, and it's a cycle that we want to try to find a way out of. Okay. To talk through a little bit further the factors that can lead to weight gain with aging, the fun topic, is we all even if we're active, unfortunately see a decline in our muscle mass, our lean tissue. As I mentioned, there's typically a reduction in physical activity for the reasons we talked about. But there's also a reduction in the mitochondria, the energy producing molecules within our cells, their ability to produce energy declines. And so that contributes also to lower levels of total energy expenditure, which unfortunately this reduction in our energy expenditure is not proportional to a reduction in desire to eat. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that with a reduction in energy expenditure and a equal or smaller reduction in the drive to eat, body weight gain and unhealthy weight gain will occur. Okay. And I want to make this point here too, because what this figure represents is the same individual hypothetically at age 25 and that same individual hypothetically at age 70. So in this case, their height and weight are identical. But something has fundamentally changed, and that is their ratio of lean tissue to fat tissue has now dramatically changed. So when this person was 25, they had a 14% total body fat compared to age 70, 30%. And when they were 25, their lean tissue was approximately 61% of their body composition, and now it's 53%. And I make that point because I want to emphasize that it's not just your body mass index, which a lot of times is what the doctor measures your height and weight and says you're doing just fine. But if you don't know what the body's changed or how it's changed, then it's hard to know thoroughly what's really happening metabolically speaking. And so yes, weight gain's an issue, but it's also important to know how much lean tissue you're maintaining. And unfortunately, what happens over time with unhealthy lifestyle changes, body weight gain, is the development of this syndrome called metabolic syndrome. How many people have heard of the metabolic syndrome? Looks like almost everybody. Okay. So I'll just go relatively quickly through this then. It's a syndrome that's diagnosed when an individual has 3 or more of these metabolic risk factors. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because we know 2 things. One, we know that it's highly related to cardiovascular disease as well as diabetes. And it's also related to dramatically increased risk of mortality in individuals who have the syndrome compared to those who don't have the syndrome. And why that's important is because with aging, the latest data that I could find was this article published in 2020. What you see is there's a pretty progressive increase where the prevalence of the syndrome basically doubles from when individuals are below the age of 40 to when they're between the ages of 40 to 59, and continues to increase in individuals 60 years or greater. So the phenomenon of aging itself is increasing risk for the syndrome largely for the reasons that I described before. And you may think, well, that's okay as long as my brain remains intact. And that's true, that you want your brain to remain intact, but I put this article here by somebody that I collaborated with, Mark Madsen, who was an outstanding researcher at the National Institute on Aging. And he wrote this great review article entitled Hallmarks of Brain Aging, Adaptive and Pathological Modification by Metabolic States. Now, we won't go into all the details of this article, but I'll just show you a key figure, what I took away from this key figure, what you see on the outside of this circle are known mechanisms of brain aging. And we're not going to go through any of these tonight, but what I want you to focus on is the inner circle, which says dysregulated energy metabolism. And so the point I want to make is that dysregulated energy metabolism not only can underlie physical health issues like cardiovascular disease, but also plays a key role in our brain health, which is why I think it's one of the many reasons why I think it's so important to pay attention to a person's metabolic health. And to kind of give a summary here, this was taken from a 2014 article highlighting how an unhealthy lifestyle can increase what's called reactive oxygen species, which can then contribute to a variety of metabolic risk factors, which can ultimately lead to the diagnosis of metabolic syndrome, which, as we know, is increased with aging and has a feedback loop with reactive oxygen species. And so somewhere in this cycle, we want to intervene to reduce the risk factors, and what I believe is up here is where we have the most control. Now, I put this up here to highlight that, yes, diet and exercise are important, of course, but it's always important to recognize that there are a number of factors that can influence our gene expression, called epigenetic modulation. These are some of the key factors. There's probably many more, but our psychological states, our social interactions, alternative medicine, what we choose to engage in, what type of drugs we're taking, the state of our microbiome. Seasonal changes can influence disease exposure, toxic chemicals, drug abuse, financial status. These all have an effect on our physiology. And so in a very real way, we're ever-changing neuroplastic people based on what we're experiencing. And I just want to highlight that, and then highlight that we also know there's a variety of biological mechanisms of aging, and these epigenetic alterations are one of a number of known factors that are biologically known to play a role in rate of aging. You can see here loss of proteostasis, so protein stability, dysregulated nutrient sensing, telomere attrition, you've probably heard of that, genomic instability, altered intercellular communication, stem cell exhaustion, cellular senescence, and then the one that I want to focus in on is mitochondrial dysfunction. Because earlier you may have remembered I talked about mitochondria and their role they may play in energy expenditure. So we want to drill down a little bit on the mitochondria and how they may relate to age-related metabolic disease conditions. We know that with aging, this change in mitochondrial's ability to produce ATP and their exposure to certain toxins can lead to mitochondrial dysfunction and lead to a supply and demand imbalance. And so the question becomes, what can we do to improve the health of our mitochondria? And this is where I want to kind of start to focus in on more positive aspects of this talk. So as you can see in the last bullet, I believe that this imbalance in energy supply and energy demand can start to be fixed through the process called hormesis, which is the concept that temporary challenges induce adaptations that ultimately lead to better function. And some of these temporary challenges you're probably familiar with: physical activity, calorie restriction, intermittent fasting. And before we get into that in more detail, just want to highlight some of the known cardiometabolic diseases that have been associated with mitochondrial dysfunction. Okay. But I promised you that we would get to the positive side. And so why I think mitochondria have a key role in this whole aging process is that when we can maintain them, we know that our metabolic regulation is necessary, and they can be pivotal for preventing a number of these age-related diseases. So what do? We we think about what are the key factors that can help induce healthier mitochondria. And that, I said it before, but sometimes the pictures are worth 1,000 words. And so from a lifestyle standpoint, we're starting to think about intermittent fasting, calorie restriction, and exercise. And that leads to the mitochondria having greater ability to fight what's called free radicals or reactive oxygen species. So you might say, I don't want to do any of these things that you're talking about. and I can understand why you would have that thought, because most of what I talk about is not necessarily fun on the surface. But just hear me out for a little while longer, I promise. What I want to point out here is we as humans have choices, but some of the choices have consequences. And if we choose to rest and only rest, based on some science, there's significant consequences to that. So this was a study that took very healthy 20-year-old men and exposed them to bed rest for a 3-week period of time. And then they looked at what changed in terms of their cardiovascular function after 3 weeks of bed rest. And what you can see is their average maximum cardio output declined by 26%. Their average VO2 max declined by 27% after just 3 weeks of bed rest, a healthy 20-year-old. Now the good news is when they exposed them to 8 weeks of training after this bed rest period, they were able to recover back to their baseline levels, basically, with training for both their cardio output and their VO2 max. But what's even more interesting is they contacted these same 20-year-olds 30 years later, and at the age of 50-ish, they had them perform these tests again. And what they found was there was only a 12% decline over the 30-year interval between when they were 20 and when they were 50, which suggests that 3 weeks of bed rest was twice as damaging in terms of cardiac function as 30 years of aging in this case. So what that study said to me was that as much as we might want to not engage in exercise and not move, there is real damaging effects to living only a sedentary lifestyle, and that the harmful effects are real. And so there's benefits to even getting up out of your chair once every hour. It doesn't have to be for a extensive exercise session, but just prolonged sedentary behavior, inactivity seems to have a detrimental effect. So that's one message that I want to convey. On the other hand, you may be somebody who's highly motivated after you hear this talk and you want to go exercise and go run and work out really hard. Well, I would also say there's a downside to overworking, just as there's a downside to inactivity or underworking. And maybe you've experienced some of these signs of overtraining, where after an exercise session you feel very sore, or the workout feels really difficult, or you have some sleeping problems or low libido, digestive issues, or feel more prone to be sick or have a poor appetite. All of these are signs that perhaps you've overtrained. And I'll get to why that's really important, because when we talk about adaptation, there is a point where you can stress the system, where it's difficult for positive adaptations to occur, at least quickly. So what's the answer here? We don't want to be too inactive, and we don't want to be overly ambitious when we embark on a lifestyle change. And this is where I believe that the phenomenon of hormesis that I mentioned earlier plays a key role. And what you can see from this figure is that if the stress, the temporary stress, is at a certain level of dose, it's really going to induce positive adaptations and create more resilient cells. And that level is going to be dependent on the person, of course, but as you expose yourself to that dose for longer and longer periods of time, there is a point where it can actually induce damage and be too much. And so really what you want to do when we're thinking about these lifestyle changes is stay within this range, in this zone, so that you can stimulate cellular pathways that support overall health. Another way to demonstrate this is with this figure. And on the left, the individual's engaging in moderate levels of exercise, eating a healthy diet, and as a result, they're experiencing positive hormesis. So they are having lower reactive oxygen species in their body. Their cells are experiencing lower levels of oxidative stress. On the right, what this is meant to depict is somebody who's not necessarily making the healthiest choices food-wise, not moving too much, and as a result experiencing higher levels of oxidative stress and more likely to develop certain metabolic disease conditions. So I've said it, but I'll probably say it a few times. The key is to balance the stress with recovery so that the positive adaptation can occur. What we know is that chronic stress is not healthy, but temporary stress followed by periods of recovery can induce positive biological changes. And nutritional stress, what do I mean by nutritional stress? That could consist of intermittent fasting. It could be following a calorie restriction plan. It could be following a ketogenic diet or a low carbohydrate diet. These are all forms of nutritional stress that initially forces the body to adapt to a change. But those are just examples. And the key is that repeated exposure to mild or moderate challenges, stimulus, promotes beneficial effects on the body at multiple organ levels, and including the brain. And so what I want to show you now is a picture, which is, I think, much easier to depict what I mean than describing it. And so this was taken from a figure from this article by Calabrese and Matson, highlighting highlighting the various effects on that. For example, in this case, the stressors of exercise and fasting can have at the cellular level, stimulating the process of autophagy. How many people have heard of autophagy? Most. Okay, it's the process of cellular waste removal. So stimulating that process, DNA repair, mitochondrial biogenesis, which means the growth of new mitochondria, and improving insulin sensitivity. It can also, at the liver level, help induce the production of gluconeogenesis, or ketone production, so producing fuel for the body. And then at the fat cell level, induce the process of lipolysis and release of fatty acids. Now that's great, but we can also affect the gastrointestinal system with the phytochemicals we're taking, the drugs we're taking, the food we're eating, can all have an effect on the GI system, which can affect the blood vessels and the circulating factors in our system, which you can see have a bidirectional effect on our cells, but also on our brain. And then we can go back up here and see that something I haven't talked yet about, intellectual challenges. Intellectual challenges, such as learning a new language, learning a new musical instrument, walking backwards, writing in cursive. These are all activities that you can do that stimulate the brain to potentially develop new synapses, new connections, and maybe even neurogenesis, which is the formation of new neurons, in addition to the lifestyle activities of fasting and exercise. And so I put this slide to illustrate that we're so interconnected, and what's helping the brain out is typically going to be helping the body out, and what's helping the body out is typically going to be helping the brain out. Okay. Now you might think that's all nice, but is there any evidence that this actually results in an extension of lifespan? I'm here to tell you that maybe. In yeast, we have a study where the yeast were one group was not exposed to any stress and one group was exposed to a little bit of stress through calorie deprivation or deprivation of nutrients. The yeast that were deprived temporarily of nutrients actually showed beneficial changes and suggest that there were epigenetic effects that resulted or would result in lifespan extension in the yeast. And so now you may be saying, that doesn't really mean anything for me. So I will present my next evidence, which is in fruit flies. Now here, we have two groups of flies. One group lived a normal fly life. They were never exposed to any additional stress aside from being a fly. But the stress group experienced temporary heat stress on a daily or every other day type of basis from the third day of life on. And what was really interesting to me was the only difference between the group was the stress group experienced mild heat and the unstressed group did not experience this. And as you can see in the figure, the stress group actually lived 10% longer from the temporary mild heat exposure. Now you might be saying you're not a fruit fly, but at least it suggests these temporary stressors ultimately could influence lifespan. We don't have, I can't show you this in humans, unfortunately, but I can show you something that you may relate to better. And that's exercise and hormesis. I know we've talked about it, but let's get more in details about how these are connected. And what you can see here is that too little stress really doesn't activate much at all in terms of expression of enzymes. And then if you can get into this hormetic zone, you're going to experience some of these nice benefits: a reduction in reactive oxygen species, improvement in internal antioxidants, a reduction in oxidative damage, and you're going to increase your body's ability to repair any oxidative damage that has occurred as long as you're in this zone. But a lot of times people want to, when they embark on a new exercise program, go too hard too fast. And as a result, they put too much stress on their system, and then they experience inflammation, insulin resistance, and potentially even mitochondrial dysfunction from too high of a dose. So I just wanted to highlight exercise in this example that most people can directly relate to, because it's likely that most people have experienced both the too little and the too much effects from exercise. Okay. Now, this may be one of the last hard figures I'll present. There may be one more. But just to walk you through it, since I mentioned nutritional stress earlier. Well, this was a great review article by Paoli in 2019, where they reviewed the literature on the effects of fasting, calorie restriction, and a ketogenic diet on known biological mechanisms of aging. And the length of the arrow depicts the strength of the evidence for each of these dietary nutritional strategies. So I won't spend too much time on each of these, but just to highlight, you can see the effects on inflammation. They all have beneficial effects in lowering inflammation. They all can lower reactive oxygen species reduction. They all can induce autophagy with fasting, having a bit greater effect than the other two. They all can induce the process of mitochondrial biogenesis, seem to improve our immune system. They can lower this growth hormone or IGF-1 axis. They all are known to affect microbiome. And then here's our hormesis hypothesis. They all can prime the system with mild to moderate levels of stress, which leads to DNA repair genes being activated, maintenance of cellular mechanisms, repair mechanisms, and greater resistance to stress. Okay. So they concluded, when we go into practical applications, what is the best, healthiest lifestyle look like? And what they said was eating 2 to 3 times a day, eating breakfast. Now this is where we may not fully agree, but I would argue that you can still eat breakfast, it just doesn't have to be in the morning. So the last meal at around 6 o'clock in the evening, so avoid late night meal, increase protein content in meals, and practice 12 to 16 hours of fasting every day to achieve some of these benefits at a cellular level and a biological level. In contrast to an unhealthy lifestyle where an individual would eat 6 or more times a day, maybe skip breakfast according to them, a late meal at night, high fat, high sugar diet, and a reduced fasting period. So I'll leave that for a second. Now, why do I think that maybe they're not quite right about the eating breakfast part? And as you heard, I have studied intermittent fasting for quite some time. I believe that the fasting period induces a number of benefits that ultimately lead to the better functioning of the brain and the body. But I have a few slides to support my position here. And so the first one is a study that looked at male mice that were exposed to either ad libitum eating, they could eat 24 hours a day whenever they wanted, or they could only eat for 13 hours of the day, which is the intermittent fasting condition, or they could eat for every 3 hours, but they were calorie restricted. And so then they looked at, this study was conducted at 2 different sites, by the way, and with the dietary composition varying at the 2 sites. So the calories in this group and in this group were identical. The food and the total calorie consumption were identical. Of course, the calories in the calorie restriction group were less. But what they found was, which I thought was quite interesting, was this blue line. The group that engaged in the intermittent fasting lived on average 10% longer than the group that ate whenever they wanted. Again, they ate the same amount of calories and the same type of calories. The only difference was when they consumed the calories. One group consumed the calories 24 hours a day, the other group only 13 hours of the day. And of course, the calorie restriction group lived the longest, in line with much previous research showing that calorie restriction does indeed have a lifespan extension effect in multiple species. Now, why? Why does time-restricted eating have these benefits? And I think there's a number of potential hypotheses, but some of them are that what we've seen in the literature so far is that it has the potential to reverse fatty liver disease, reduce blood cholesterol, improve blood pressure, potentially reverse type 2 diabetes, improve sleep, improve gut health. And I think one of the key mechanisms for all of these beneficial effects is by increasing autophagy, or cellular waste removal. When we go into a fasting state, our body is better able to activate this process that seems so important for our health and longevity. In addition, and I won't spend too much time on this figure, but just to make a couple key points, that when we are fasting or when we're exercising, we're forcing these bioenergetic challenges that induce a number of biological changes that ultimately leads to greater resistance in our cells. And then when we switch back, the process of metabolic switching, we actually start to repair and regenerate the cell growth and plasticity occurs during that period, which if we can engage in this process of metabolic switching more frequently than most people do, we can start to build more resilience and disease resistance. Said differently by Mark Twain, a little starvation can really do more for the average sick person than can the best medicines and the best doctors. So throughout much of this talk, I've focused in on our lifestyle, but I really want to point out that the process of hormesis can be activated by a number of activities and choices we make. And it really comes down to the dose. So as you can see up here, first thing, I have alcohol and caffeine or coffee. You might say, well, those aren't good for you. And I would say it depends on the dose. It could be that some alcohol, a small dose, can activate all of the beneficial changes. Some dose of caffeine, too much is not great, but too little is not great either. From ultimately affecting your body's regenerative capacity. Of course, we talked about intermittent fasting. We talked about heat exposure, plant phytochemicals, calorie restriction, cold exposure. You've probably heard many people going into ice baths or cold tanks, and that does seem to have the potential, again, to activate many of these biological pathways. Again, if we stayed in a cold plunge for many hours, we would not be in a healthy state. But maybe 5 minutes does induce positive adaptations. Similarly, for the sun, there is probably a level of sun exposure that could have beneficial effects. Too much, we know, is not good. And similar for physical exercise, we know that some is good, too much has the potential to not be as good. So to kind of conclude with, I wanted to show a few key figures that maybe can drive home this point that I want to make, is that when we live a lifestyle that never challenges our minds or bodies, which I call low hormesis, we don't engage in much exercise, we're eating an unhealthy diet, and we're not really challenging ourselves cognitively. As a result, our mitochondria are never experiencing any stress to adapt and become stronger, and as a result, our energy level is lower than it could be. Now, you might say, well, I do some of that. And I would say, that's good, that's better. And so maybe you can relate to this slide where maybe you exercise regularly, but your diet could use some improvement, and maybe you read or do other forms of cognitive training, and as a result, you probably experience a little bit better energy than the person who did none of those activities. The same could be said if you engaged in either a healthy diet or practiced intermittent fasting combined with cognitive activity. But if you engage in all three, you can see how your energy bars would progressively go up. And if you could add a little heat exposure, a little cold exposure, then perhaps it could go up even more. And so I want to make the point that, and I referenced this book called Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb, because our bodies are truly anti-fragile. And what do I mean by that? I mean that we are not fragile in that we're damaged by disorder or temporary stressors. We're not just resilient in that we can tolerate temporary stressors, but we are actually designed to be anti-fragile, which means we benefit from temporary stressors, and that's what our body and minds need, is these temporary stressors to continue to be healthy and strong. And so to conclude, I'll say that I believe hormetic stressors, temporary challenges, are critical to our health and long-term survival. What, when, and how much we eat and exercise are all important variables to consider as part of a healthy lifestyle. But because we are all built different, there's unlikely to be a one-size-fits-all approach. And with that, I'll say thank you very much for your time and attention. Oh, sure.
On cold exposure, do you have an opinion on doing ice water in the face, but not deep enough that you get it in the ears, and doing that, say, breathing through a straw or snorkel for 3 minutes on cold exposure because of all the cranial nerve stimulation? Any research on that, as well as with and without the carb restriction and intermittent eating, where you may take methylene blue for mitochondrial support and cognitive, as well doing it with the carb restriction and intermittent fasting, and then not doing anything but taking it? Any opinion?
Lots of good questions there. These are that's definitely more challenging questions than I anticipated, but I like it because we like challenges. The first question, and to be honest, though, the first question I am not in a position to answer because I'm not a COVID expert and I'm not quite sure. I don't have a great answer. The second question, though, if you're taking a certain supplement, could it benefit the effects of calorie restriction, the methylene blue? Is that what you were asking? If you were for mitochondrial, the answer is it's possible. The problem is without a study, I can't sit here and say yes, you should do that. But I certainly could see the potential for that to be beneficial, for the reasons I showed up there before. And what I do know is there are a number of biological compounds that have shown some beneficial effects on mitochondria, independent of the lifestyle changes that we mentioned, calorie restriction, physical activity. No matter what, we know the lifestyle changes will produce, let's just say, 80 to 90% of the benefits. And so perhaps that you could achieve an extra 10% by taking certain biological compounds. Good question. I think.
Welcome to Pensacola.
Thank you.
Glad you're here.
Appreciate you.
My son was a White House fellow, 6 months under Bush, 6 months under Obama, and one of his classmates was Mike Evans, a 2-time Navy SEAL commander. And he said really the American, the worldview, or the whole idea of life being pivoted around comfort was a mistake. The real deal was to, like you've mentioned, to really adapt to stress and be stronger and better tomorrow than you were today. So that's where the exercise comes in. So can we really ask ourselves as seniors to get away from the worldview of that we deserve to be comfortable and happy as seniors, and just engage in stress, modest stress as seniors, to be able to maintain our healthy lifestyle?
Thank you for that question, and thanks for the nice welcome. The important point that I probably should have made during the presentation is when you engage in this type of lifestyle, I believe the result is you have an enhanced quality of life, an enhanced level of happiness. You feel better. You have more energy. You're more engaged with life. So, in my opinion, asking you to engage in these activities should result in a better quality of life. Now, it comes back to, what do we mean by exercise? What do we mean by engaging in mild heat stress? It could be that for somebody, a 5-minute walk is sufficient to induce some level of adaptation, and then the next day they're able to do 6 minutes, or over time they build up. So just to clarify, when I say exercise, I don't necessarily mean going out on track and running fast, or going to the gym and working so hard that you feel terrible. That would be excessive, and that would not induce the positive adaptation. So with the last slide, I made the point that for each person, it's going to be different. And so for everyone, they have to decide, okay, what's the level that is just challenging enough for me that I induce these positive adaptations, but not so challenging that it ultimately hurts my ability to recover. You're welcome. Couple.
Hi, I'm Stacey Levine. I was wondering, how do you know when exercise is too much? And the reason I'm asking is because I have an uncle who exercised all the time. He biked, he ran, amazing stuff, and he unfortunately developed diabetes, and he's now in a wheelchair. And so it just, leads to that question.
It's a good question. I tried to put in one of the earlier slides that you may or may not remember the signs of overtraining that can be kind of warning signs of, such as headache, you have trouble sleeping, you're more prone to colds, low libido, irritability, these types of things. You feel excessively sore. A little soreness is okay, excessive soreness, not so great. These are kind of the warning signs that, unfortunately, sometimes our culture and many people say, well, just ignore that, keep pushing. And if you ignore it for too long, it can result, unfortunately, in a negative outcome of certain disease conditions if we just keep pushing past the warning signs. So I hope that helps to recognize when we're overdoing it. Yeah.
Let me follow up. Stacy's husband, Gary. And thank you for describing intermittent fasting. And you also said to eat breakfast, but have intermittent fasting. So do I take it from there that you have breakfast, essentially skip lunch, and then have dinner? And how do you do it so you don't feel hungry? She will tell you, I'm awful if I'm not hungry to be around. And so how do you maintain your metabolism or get your body to the point where it can tolerate it? And it sounds like that, along with a moderate exercise. And if I looked at the length of all of those arrows, it seemed like intermittent fasting had the longest combined average of all of those arrows, and I forget the color on that particular slide.
Great questions. To answer the first question, the term breakfast is a term that we've created that previously meant break fast. So we call it breakfast. It could be lunch, it could be brunch, but it just means the first meal of the day. And now what I think you're asking though is, well, how do you postpone that first meal of the day until noon-ish without feeling excessively hungry or irritable or what have you, so that you feel compelled to eat? And because when we're doing this, we don't want to feel uncomfortable to the point where it's just something we'll never do again. And what I would say, probably you can guess from the talk, to adapt to fasting is similar to adapt to exercise. If you can currently, let's just say for hypothetical reasons, you can currently run 1 mile. Well, the next step is not to go try to run 5 miles. The next step is to try to run 1.25 miles and then move towards that. Let's just say you can currently fast until 9 a.m. feeling comfortable. That's great. Well, the next step then may be to go try to get to 9:15, see how your body feels. And then over time, maybe you can move the time back a little bit more. Now, there are other strategies such as taking a little walk while you're fasting or engaging in cognitively challenging tasks that some people report to help them with the fasting, as well as a little coffee. So those are all just ideas, but without knowing too much more, those are just off-the-cuff suggestions. Yeah.
As relates to mitochondrial function, zone 2 exercise is advocated by some. Presumably that has something to do with lactate. Could you discuss the mechanism of zone 2 exercise and mitochondrial function?
I don't know that I could discuss the mechanism of zone. Can you say more about what you mean by zone 2 exercise?
I guess the equilibrium between lactate production and absorption. And the research I've read shows that in that condition, there is far higher mitochondrial biogenesis and mitophagy at the same time. So I'm just trying to figure out why is it that condition of zone 2 exercise produces those outcomes.
So to be completely honest, I don't have the answer. My guess would be that if you push temporarily to a certain level, that causes the body to have to respond, and the mitochondria are the the source was within the cell that will have to respond to that energy demand that's being placed on it by the zone 2 level, and in turn will likely stimulate more mitochondrial biogenesis. That's my best guess. I thought I saw.
Just a quick caveat to the question about fasting. I have learned, for me, it's different for everyone. I do dinner for breakfast. I need fuel in the morning. But at the end of the day, I could really care less about food. Does it matter what end of the clock you fast on?
Good question, and I'm glad you brought that up, because this is first of all, let me say there's a growing body of research that suggests what you're doing, the early time restricted eating, is very beneficial, metabolically speaking, and certain people can, as you just described, feel better if they eat early, but don't need to eat a dinner meal. And that is certainly a very good form of time restricted eating, from what I know from the research. So I don't think we have the perfect answer of which one is better or not, but I think what is better is the one that suits you. And if you're able to do that consistently, that sounds great to me. And if maybe that's another approach for him.
I kind of have a two-part question. Are you kind of advocating then putting yourself into ketosis, like the keto diet? Because as a nurse, we were always into the, food groups and calorie counting, and it seems like now doctors are telling people, oh yeah, go on a keto diet, which, high fat, high meat and all that, and not so much vegetables. And my second question is, our age group is kind of what I call the sandwich generation, where we're dealing with parents that are in their 90s and grandchildren, and that to me is the highest stress level.
Yeah.
And that's you're twixt in between, and you're stretched both ways, and that's the hardest stress to me. Not exercising, not running or doing anything. It's all that other stuff.
Good questions. So, to your first question, the ketogenic diet was an example of a form of nutritional stress that could induce positive adaptations, similar to time-restricted eating or other forms of intermittent fasting. When somebody engages in time-restricted eating, they are not getting into a state of ketosis because it's too short of a fasting period for that to occur. They might start to get some ketones into the system, but it's not going to put them in a state of ketosis. Whether or not that's a diet that works for you is something that everybody has to experiment with. Some people do great on it. Other people say they have a hard time. And same with intermittent fasting and calorie restriction. So those are just options to consider. In terms of your other comment, the stress that you reported, I think many people probably can relate to. And I think that part may not be under your direct control, but what I spoke to is more under your control in the sense of that it can put you in the best state to be able to handle the outside stressors that are going to happen and that we all have to deal with. And those are not the sources of stress that I consider health promoting sources of stress. Yeah. Oh, thank you.